You are punishing me for the crime of not being Anna May, she cried. For a moment, Wyatt looked as though he might be angry enough to strike her, but Milly didn't care. She'd come out to the fields to have her say. The consequences be damned, and before she left this cursed place behind, she was going to be heard. Before she could speak again, the angry expression on his face crumpled. He let his shoulders slump as he silently thought about what she'd said, then finally dropped his head as violent sobs racked his body. "You're right. It's true. Because no one could ever be Anna May." He released the pain he'd carried all these months, letting the hurt at losing her and the anger he'd felt at her leaving him alone to raise 3 motherless children pour out. Milly stood idly by, unsure of what to do next. She knew how to respond to a man who was mean and spiteful and downright aggravating. But this was a man who was broken and clinging desperately to the pieces of his former self. The sight of him sobbing while standing in the middle of the wide-open land he'd bought with his wife was enough to tear away all the insults she'd endured since arriving in Montana. But she was angry all the same. It wasn't her fault he was hurting, and it wasn't her fault that he'd brought her here to marry him, knowing his heart still ached for a woman he would never see again. Milly closed her eyes and took a deep breath, then came around to stand beside Wyatt. She reached a tentative hand out and placed it on his shoulder, relieved when he didn't pull away like an unbroken horse. "Mr. Flynn, Wyatt, I am ever so sorry about your wife. Of course I never knew her, but I can see the way her spirit still torments you. You must have loved her very, very much." His sobs quieted for a moment, and he nodded his head without lifting it to look at her. "This pain you carry, though, it's not what she wanted." Wyatt looked up slowly, turning his gaze toward Milly with a questioning look that begged her to make it all right. He waited for her to continue, his eyes so filled with agony that she almost had to look away. She forced herself to stare directly in his eyes, and there was no turning away from what she had to tell him. "What do you want from me?" he asked in a muffled whisper, his voice barely carrying past where his arms encircled him. "I should think it is I who should be asking you that question," she answered kindly, dropping down near the post to look up at him. "Why did you bring me here?